Few countries in the hemisphere are as defined by a single river as Argentina is by the Rio de la Plata. But although the river has deeply shaped Argentine history and development, there's more to the country that should not be overlooked. To see why, join me in this brief look at the country's political geography. Argentina is the world's 8th largest country and one of the most urbanized places in the globe, with 92% of its population living in urban areas. It is also the largest Spanish-speaking country on the planet, roughly 1.4 times bigger than the next one, Mexico. Unlike Mexico, however, its population is more densely packed, because while Mexico has 10 cities around 1 million or more spanning its entire land area, Argentina only has 3. The first one, Buenos Aires, includes 7.2% of all Argentine population, but that's only if we include its official political demarcation. If instead we include the whole metro area, that number raises to 32%. The next 3 largest cities are Córdoba, Rosario, and Mendoza, with roughly 1.4, 1.2, and just under 1 million, respectively. The disparity was not always this vast between cities. When the Spanish crown created the Viceroyalty of La Plata, Córdoba had about the same population as Buenos Aires, around 20,000, while Salta had a little over half, 11,000. The reason for this was simple. Despite Buenos Aires' strategic location, in order to have more control over commerce, the crown banned the city from engaging in free trade. Instead, until the 1770s, any exchange between Spain and Argentina had to first go through Callao, a port in Peru, now a suburb of Lima, which made trade extremely slow and expensive and turned Buenos Aires' advantageous location against it. Once trade routes opened up, however, Buenos Aires began growing at a sustained rate and never looked back. A similar phenomenon happened with Rosario, the country's 3rd largest city, which also saw its growth limited as a result of a ban on trade. Although this one came not from the Spanish, but from Juan Manuel de Rosas, Argentine's most prominent caudillo of the 19th century. Once he was deposed by Urquiza, however, the new ruler opened up trade along the river, and the city soon became Argentina's first export outlet and a major population center. Argentina has at least 15 ecoregions, although the exact number can vary depending on who's doing the defining. The reason is that the Andes, which create a north to south geographical spine in the country, along with the Chaco in the north, make for extremely varied and complicated ecosystems. For example, within and around the Cordillera of the Andes, there are 3 types of grasslands and 2 types of forests. There's the Puna grassland in the far north, which has a cold desert climate and contains llamas, alpacas, and vicuñas, and which in turn is divided into 2 regions, the Puna and Dry Puna. The second one is called that because it's windier and more arid than the first one. Then there's the southern Andean steppe, which is similar in climate but has different endemic plants, like llaretas. As far as the forests, the first are the Magellanic subpolar forests, which follow the Cordillera to the tip of the Tierra del Fuego and are cold, often foggy, and extremely windy. So much so that among its windswept vegetation, a common view is that of flag trees that grow only to one side because the windward branches are killed or deformed by the constant winds. Because of the tough climate and recent formation by glaciers, fauna tends to be limited, but they are home to the pudu, the world's smallest deer, and to vizcachas, rodents that most closely resemble rabbits, although they're not related at all. The other type of forest is the Valdivian temperate rainforest, which are just north of the first. Much warmer than the neighboring southern forests, they have a more diverse flora and fauna than their Magellanic cousins, like conifers and bamboos, as well as the cotcod or guiña, the smallest cat species native to the Americas. Needless to say, the various regions just mentioned are very sparsely populated, and other than as part of a border dispute with Chile, have not been particularly important historically, although tourism in the last few decades has been changing that. Today, the glacier Perito Moreno, Ushuaia, and the Lake District around Bariloche are increasingly popular. The 15 or more ecoregions usually get reduced to 6 or 7 broader zones. These are the Argentine Northwest, the Gran Chaco, Mesopotamia, Cuyo, Sierras Pampeanas, Pampas, and Patagonia. Crisscrossed as it is by the Andes Mountains, the Northwest ecosystems are quite diverse, from high Andean to semi-tropical forests called yungas. As the Sierras descend into the Gran Chaco further east, some fertile valleys dot the landscape. The Spanish picked two of the most important ones to found the cities of San Salvador de Jujuy and Salta, respectively. But the most picturesque of the lot, or at least the one that gets the most selfies, is the Quebrada de Humahuaca, a UNESCO heritage site. That's largely because of the town of Puramarca and its backdrop, the Cerro de los Siete Colores, or Seven Colors Hill, which look like this. The vibrant colors are the result of the different sediments that have accumulated over millions of years, but local legend has it that a long time ago, the town's children, tired of the grays in the surrounding area, sneaked out every night and added a different color. If you visit, you'll see why. The hill does look like someone painted it. Another part of the Northwest distinctiveness is its indigenous influence, which is disproportionate in Salta and Jujuy. The main groups are the Cuyas, Quechuan speakers, as well as the Huichi, both of whom also live in Bolivia. This is evident in the food and music typical of the region. The Northwest was the political center of gravity during colonial times, and for a while yet after independence it held its own. It is not a coincidence that the official Declaration of Independence occurred in Tucumán in 1816 and not in Buenos Aires, which had tried to do so before, but its conditions were not accepted by the western provinces. You can see that today in the many colonial buildings and churches that still remain, including the Casa de Tucumán, where the separation from Spain was officially proclaimed. The Gran Chaco region was the exact opposite. The Spanish never had control of the area, and although they tried to create a settlement that would connect Asunción with the rest of the main Spanish outposts, the local indigenous groups, like the COM, did not take too kindly to this and constantly attacked it or otherwise stole from the Spanish, which led them to the abandonment of their main town of Concepción del Bermejo. After independence, the Chaco was part of several border disputes with Bolivia and Paraguay, which were not settled until the decimation of Paraguay during the Triple Alliance War in 1870. Hot and semi-arid, it took a while for the region to be incorporated into the larger Argentine economy, but it finally did when, at the turn of the 20th century, it received a large number of immigrants, such as Germans and Mennonites from Russia, Germany, and Canada, who in turn transformed the region into a productive farming area, which today still produces beef and dairy. Meanwhile, Mesopotamia, so called because it's the area between the confluence of the Paraná and Uruguay rivers, is a continuation of the Brazilian plateau, and as such, the northern part is covered with subtropical forests around Misiones, while the south, around Entre Rios, is full of fertile pasture land. Once a serious challenger to the primacy of Buenos Aires, for a while it was part of the Federal League led by Gervasio Artigas in the late 1810s, and later as the leader of the Argentine Confederation during the brief secession of Buenos Aires in the 1850s, under the direction of Justo José de Urquiza. Today, its economic output is significant, but perhaps its most important contribution to Argentine well-being is its vast production of yerba mate, Argentina's ubiquitous tea drink. The Cuyo region is a semi-arid area with little rainfall at the edge of the Andes Mountains. Historically, the area has had closer ties to Chile than distant Buenos Aires, even if separated by the largest peak in the Americas, the Aconcagua. Indeed, Mendoza, the main city in the Cuyo, is named after a Chilean governor who sent the founding expedition in 1561. It was also here that the army led by San Martin and O'Higgins that would cross the Andes and guarantee Argentine independence would start from. Today, its main economic activity is tourism and viticulture. Indeed, the region accounts for over 65% of all wine produced in Argentina, which in turn is the fifth largest producer of wine in the world. The Sierras Pampeanas are a chain of mountains and valleys between the Andes and the Pampas. They surround Córdoba, the second largest city in the country. The region too was an early competitor with Buenos Aires. Most famously, it was here that Santiago de Liniers, the leader that had succeeded in impeding the British invasions in 1806 and 1808, was executed by May Junta forces when he tried to lead a counter-revolution against them on August 26, 1810. It was also here that in a much different context, one of the major civil uprisings against the dictatorship of Juan Carlos Onganía took place at the end of May 1969. Known as the Cordobazo, it was the massive repression of what began as a strike and then turned to popular resistance. It resulted in at least 4 dead, 170 wounded, and hundreds more detained. It was a key 20th century event in Argentine history as it weakened the dictatorship and paved the way for the eventual return of Perón. The Pampas are the fertile lowland grasslands that have traditionally served as the main economic agriculture motor of the country, centered around the port of Buenos Aires. The area south of the Rio Salado, however, was controlled by indigenous groups well into the late 19th century. This ended in the 1870s when the Argentine army engaged in a military campaign that it called the quote-unquote conquest of the desert, which killed around 1,000 Mapuches, displaced 15,000 more, and even led to the enslavement of some. This in turn opened up the Pampas to white settlement, which expanded the country's breadbasket. The Patagonia was part of the last quote-unquote desert campaign in 1881, and its native inhabitants suffered a similar fate to those further north. Except for the grasslands around Rio Negro, however, the region was not nearly as fertile, and it never became an agricultural powerhouse. Instead, much of its economy today is extractive, particularly mining and petroleum refining. The country is divided into 24 political units called provinces, except for the city of Buenos Aires, which is referred to as either autonomous or federal capital. Regardless of the name, all are constitutionally equal in levels of autonomy and federal representation, although it should be said that in the case of the city of Buenos Aires, this cost a lot of spilled blood, as much of the 19th century was plagued by civil wars that revolved around this very question. The provinces differ widely in size, wealth, and population. The largest is Buenos Aires province, not to be confused with the city which it surrounds. This province is the hinterland that was removed as part of the deal that solved the problem we were just talking about. It is followed in size by Santa Cruz, Chubut, and Rio Negro, all in the Patagonia. The smallest, if we don't include the city of Buenos Aires, is Tierra del Fuego, a tiny southern outpost that in theory also includes all of Argentina's Antarctic claims, although the country has no effective control of it outside of some military bases. Wealth is roughly distributed in a north to south pattern. The poorest provinces are in the north, namely Chaco and Formosa, and the richest are in the south, specifically Tierra del Fuego and Chubut. This is only slightly because of the population. Formosa has a comparable population to Chubut, for example, but rather it is because of differences in economic activity, mining and refining of petroleum versus dairy agriculture. The exception to this pattern is the city of Buenos Aires, whose GDP accounts for a little over a third of the entire country's GDP. If we also include the province of Buenos Aires, it becomes somewhere over half of the country's GDP. Thus, even after multiple boom and bust cycles, civil wars, dictatorships, and the return of democracy, what happens in Buenos Aires still has a disproportionate effect in Argentina. This is not to say that politically speaking, the city dominates the country necessarily. Since the return of democracy, the candidate preferred by the city has won only 4 out of 9 elections, including once when a former mayor of the city became president in 2015, Mauricio Macri. Besides that, the only political geographical pattern of note is that the poorest provinces in the country, Chaco and Formosa, tend to vote for the Peronist candidate, while the city of Buenos Aires tends to vote for non-Peronist candidates. Since Argentina returned to democracy in 1983, the former have voted for the Peronist candidate every single time, except for Chaco for De la Rúa in 1999, while Buenos Aires did the opposite, except for Cristina Kirchner in 2011. Thus, we conclude our trip across the Argentine landscape. I hope you can visit someday.